Welcome to the San Francisco Writers Conference podcast, a celebration of craft, commerce, and community. I'm your host, Matthew Felix, and I'm here today with Charlie Jane Anders. Charlie Jane.
Hi.
Hello. Charlie Jane is the author of The City in the Middle of the Night and All the Birds in Her Sky, or in the Sky, rather. Her fiction and journalism have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, McSweeney's, Mother Jones, Tor.com, Wired, and many other places. Her TED Talk, Go Ahead, Dream About the Future, got 700,000 views in its first week. And with Annalee Newitz, she co-hosts the podcast, Our Opinions Are Correct. By far, her biggest distinction, however, is that she has just agreed to be a keynote speaker at the 2022 San Francisco Writers Conference, which, of course, we are very excited about. Welcome, Charlie Jane.
Hi, it's so great to be here, and I'm so honored that I get to be a keynote speaker. That's so exciting.
It's going to be great, and we're really looking forward to that in 2022. Okay, so you begin your new book, Never Say You Can't Survive, which is there in your background, by writing, quote, 2020 was the worst year of my life. One thing got me through that hell year, dreaming up imaginary worlds and larger than life people who never lived. With the essays in this book, I was reminding myself that writing can be an act of self-preservation, that creativity gives us heart and purpose and clarity and the ability to keep going. And not only did you keep going, but in spite of a really difficult year, you were also very productive, as we're going to talk about. You wrote not one, but two books, and maybe others, but you ended up publishing at least two books from that period. The other one being Victories Greater than Death, which we're also going to talk about.
Yay.
Well, let's start with the newer of the two. The one, there's Victories. Yeah, you want to hold it up? Victories Greater than Death.
Yes. Oh gosh,
there it is. That works.
A little tricky with Zoom.
Yeah,
okay.
With the Zoom background. But let's start with the newer of the two, the nonfiction, Never Say You Can't Survive. At a high level, can you just give us kind of the elevator pitch of what the book's about?
Yeah, I mean, Never Say You Can't Survive is basically a manual and like a book of advice about how to get through really hard, scary times, such as a pandemic and a political upheaval and a bunch of natural disasters, by making up stories, by losing yourself in your own creativity and your own imagination, and kind of spending time with your own imaginary friends just in the world. And, it's primarily aimed at like fiction writers, but I try to gear a lot of the advice towards creative nonfiction writers as well. Right. And I think that just, part of what allows us to kind of keep ourselves in one piece when things are really scary and upsetting and horrifying is this ability to get sucked into a story and kind of live vicariously through characters and live in another world that's like not our world exactly, even if it's our world with a few differences. And, that ability to kind of get lost in a story is so important when things are bad. And it's what we all do when we're reading or binge watching on Netflix or whatever. But I think I'm kind of arguing that if you're writing your own story, you get that feeling of being drawn into a story and kind of lost in this, fictional world to a much greater degree, to an even greater, more amazing degree.
Right. And you just mentioned characters as obviously a big part of that. And that's actually what you start the book off with after the introduction. You talk about the importance of characters and you say, your protagonist can provide you with a whole alternate consciousness. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is definitely a thing that I found. Like I used to think that authors who talked about like their characters having a mind of their own were being a little pretentious. And then I felt like it started happening to me at a certain point. And I really started to feel like the stories I was writing and the books I was writing were like more exciting. And they were at their most exciting when the characters felt like they had a separate life and a separate existence. And they were on their own journey. And I was kind of just there with them rather than kind of, puppeteering them. I was actually, kind of getting drawn into their perspective. And the more I could see things through their eyes and through their senses, the more I didn't feel like I was just writing, versions of myself or like just kind of, stick figures that I'm kind of pushing around, but like people who have their own life and their own goals and desires, and concerns and loves and hates and everything, which might be very different from my own. And, especially if you're writing people who are not from the exact background and the exact kind of set of circumstances yourself, it can be really great to just kind of let go and imagine that other perspective. But also, I think that, part of what I talk about in the book is that when you're creating a fictional character, how you get deeper into that character, how you kind of find that character and discover them is by becoming curious, by finding reasons to be curious about this person and finding things that you're like, oh, I want to know more about this. And even though if it's a thing that you came up with 5 minutes ago, you're like, okay, wow, what does that mean? Why is this person doing that? And you want to just drill down into that. And characters who have kind of a mystery, or not even a mystery, but things that you want to know more about, like a contradiction or something that's kind of unusual about them. You want to find out more. And the only way you can find out more is by writing them in the world, living their lives and kind of dealing with stuff.
Right.
So I think that's really fun.
And what they do or what they can do can sometimes lead to unexpected things, right? We've talked about, you're basically giving the characters agency and you're kind of almost channeling them, for lack of a better word, right? You're just, like you said, you're not just the puppeteer. They're making their own decisions and things are happening that you don't necessarily anticipate as the author. In the book, you say, for me, a good writing day is one where something happens in my story that I never saw coming, which I love that. Can you touch on that a little?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like one of the great joys of writing and one of the reasons why writing is so powerful in distracting us from, the trash fire of the outside world is that it's fundamentally unpredictable and that you can't really know what's going to happen in a story, even if you've planned every detail, even if you're like, okay, exactly beat by beat, exactly what happens. If you are really inhabiting these characters and really kind of living through them, there are going to be things that happen that you're not going to see coming, and that, things that they kind of do in the moment, choices they make, or just things that they say or feel that you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And that makes total sense, but it's not what I thought was going to happen. Because, I find that when I'm thinking about a situation from a distance in the abstract, it's very different than when I'm in the situation. That's true in real life too.
Right.
If you're like, there are oftentimes in real life where you're like, okay, well, I got this big thing coming up next week and this is what's going to happen. And then once you're there, you're like, oh yeah, this is that I'm in the middle of this situation. There's all these, it feels totally different from this thing I was setting myself up for. So I think that's the thing that fiction gives you even more of, because your characters are going to do their own thing.
Right.
And some of my funnest parts of Victories Greater than Death were definitely when the characters kind of went in a different direction than I thought they were going to. And it was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's really cool.
So one thing that I've wondered about and struggled about as an author myself is, how do you find that balance between having enough structure to get to the end of a book, but still allowing for that sort of spontaneity that we're talking about, and allowing for that space for things to happen that you're not anticipating?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tricky balance to strike, because obviously, if you get too spontaneous and just kind of follow every, oh, this is an interesting, digression, or this is kind of an interesting direction to go in, you might never arrive at an ending. I mean, I find that, for me personally, I will do some outlining beforehand. I will also do a lot of outlining after I finish writing a draft to kind of figure out where all the beats are and what order they should fall in and how far apart they should be. And just generally, what are the things that I just wrote that, that add up to a story, and what's the story they add up to. So I think that's a thing that I kind of struggle with personally. But also, I mean, I think that, you kind of just have to I think part of listening to your characters and paying attention to your world is that the characters will tell you more about the conflict or the kind of central issue that they're grappling with in the story. They'll keep kind of throwing themselves at that wall and trying to get through that. And, if you pay attention to them, they will kind of find ways forward towards a resolution of the conflict that are kind of organic. And I find that, oftentimes I have an idea in my head of how the story is going to end. I have an idea of this thing that I've put down over here. There's these little elements that I've left in place that I think are going to come together at the end. And, I have to rewrite the ending 20 times sometimes to make it work. It's always a little bit of a struggle to make the ending work. But I always kind of have an idea in my head of what the ending is going to be, or at least at a certain point I get that idea. But getting there and the actual moves of getting there often are something that I kind of I will sometimes write something 10 different ways and just be like, okay, which way actually makes sense? How do we get from this place that we're into this place that I need the characters to be in for this ending to work? in a way that feels organic and earned and real for the characters, and not something that we're just, pushing them around with a giant like shuffleboard thing.
Right. Yes.
But I think it's tricky, and like, every book is different, and I feel like even if you outlined really carefully, you're going to get lost at times. You're going to get stuck and be like, okay, I don't actually know how to get, I painted myself into a little bit of a corner here. These characters are now kind of off where I thought they were going to be, and I don't know how to get them to where I need them to be by the end of the book. And I'm just going to like, sometimes you just have to kind of struggle with it and kind of find that balance between letting the characters do their thing and maybe having external forces kind of push them in the direction you need them to be in.
Right.
And that is a valid thing of like, oh, but you wanted to get on this boat. Well, the boat just burst into flames. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah.
And that's legit, life, the characters don't control what's happening in the story any more than I do.
Yeah.
It's a balance.
That's actually, a quick tangent. That's actually one of the things that I loved about Victories Greater Than Death. Repeatedly, I thought I knew where the story was going, and there would be something where it wasn't as easy as it could have been, where something happened that clearly the characters just got screwed and had to figure it out, but in a way that was just so believable. That happened repeatedly. That was one thing I really appreciated about the book. But anyway,
thank
you. But something you just mentioned, struggles, and our struggles as a writer. And this is still in your first section of Never Say You Can't Survive. You talk about the struggle that we have as writers sometimes to give ourselves permission to write. Can you talk about that? Why do we need to give ourselves permission? Why can't we necessarily just do it?
I think that people build up this like mystique in their heads about like writing, that writing is this huge kind of, terrifying thing that like you have to be like a master craftsperson to be able to do it. And like the way we talk about craft, I think is sometimes a little bit intimidating. And I think a lot of writers tend to mystify a little bit their process because we don't want to really talk about how it works. And it's like, it's this thing that we know is kind of seat of our pants. And so we try to pretend we know what we're doing. And so for someone who's like new to it, it's like, oh, well, all these writers know what they're doing and I don't know what I'm doing. And therefore I'm clearly not doing something right. And it's like, no, none of us know what we're doing either. We're just really good at faking it. And that's how we get the books done, is partly by convincing ourselves that we know what we're doing. And so we want everybody else to think that we knew what we were doing all along too. But I think also, I talk a lot about in the book about imposter syndrome.
That was my next question.
And so I think imposter syndrome is a big part of it. And I think that people just put pressure on themselves in various ways. And like, I think that we sort of lose track of this idea that writing should be fun, or at least at times it can be fun. It's sometimes writing is going to be challenging and difficult and, a slog. There's parts of the process that are a total slog, but there should at least be times when you're like, oh my gosh, I'm having a total blast. I'm like making up all this cool stuff. I'm building all these cool things into my world. And these characters are just like going in all these really cool directions. And like, oh my gosh, this is such a blast. And I feel like people sometimes like think that because you're trying to create a work of art, or because you're trying to create a product that you're going to eventually go around selling to people, that you need to take it seriously. And I think that that can be the death of creativity, unfortunately.
Yeah. How do we deal, just before we move on from this notion of the imposter syndrome, do you have any thoughts on how to, I guess you did sort of imply maybe not take things so seriously, but any other thoughts on how to deal with imposter syndrome, particularly for people who are just getting started?
Yeah, I think imposter syndrome is super insidious. I still have a ton of it. A lot of writers I know, even ones who have been published in some pretty high profile venues or gotten, some acclaim or whatever, are still dealing with imposter syndrome. And it's one of those things that kind of, it changes as your career moves forward. You have different imposter syndrome as a beginning writer than as a somewhat more established writer, but it never stops being a thing. And that's, that sucks. But, imposter syndrome is just, I feel like a lot of dealing with imposter syndrome is finding community and finding people who can support you and who are in it with you, like other writers and like also readers who you can just remind yourself that you love books, that you love stories, and that, you're doing this because you love this stuff. And I think that, I feel like every writer I know has like an angel and a devil on their shoulder, to use an old hoary kind of metaphor or whatever. And the angel on their shoulder is telling them that we're all in this together and that we all just love books and stories and that we all want to see each other succeed. And that, it's not a zero-sum game at all. We're all like, some other writer's success might actually make your success more likely because it makes people look hungry for more books that like that one. And maybe you're going to write the book that they're going to find because they were looking for more books like this other one that they read. And, but also just like that, the more we can all just encourage each other and like make each other do better work and just, try to like stay focused on just all doing our best work and being the best writers we could be. And, giving each other feedback and encouragement and, all that stuff.
Yep.
And then the devil on your shoulder, I think, is the one who's just sort of, telling you that it's a zero-sum game, or that, that you have to do X, Y, and Z, or you're not a real writer, and like gets you stuck in all these rules about the right way to do writing, or the right way to be a writer, or you have to write every day, or you have to like, wear a special hat, or I don't know. And, and just plays on your insecurity and plays on your like your feeling of that you're not as good as other writers, or that you're, other writers are getting cookies that you're not getting or whatever. And I think that we all need to just get better at listening to the angel and less good at listening to that devil on our shoulders.
Excellent advice. And not only for writing, across the board, excellent advice, I think. But speaking of the devil, part of the impetus for this book, my understanding is that, again, we're going through some tough times, and writing can help you dealing with these tough times. And something you say along those lines with regards to what to write during these tough times. And this also ties into what you were just saying about, again, this idea we should be doing certain things and we should be doing it a certain way. But you say, quote, whatever you are able to write in this tough time is self-evidently the right project for you. And I just like that for a whole bunch of reasons. But can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this is another thing that I've noticed happens a lot when things get really hard, and when, the political situation gets more scary and people are just like struggling, is that, you might find yourself putting pressure on yourself to write the thing that you think you're supposed to be writing. And that could be like the thing that a project that you started that you're determined to finish. It could be that you're like, well, in the middle of this pandemic and, all our political woes, I want to write something that really speaks to that. I want to write a pandemic story. I want to write a story about, climate change or whatever. And, and then if you're forcing yourself to write something that's not what's going to make you happy, or that's what's going to make you able to keep going, that's, maybe not going to work out. And I think that I had so many conversations, in the last few years with people who are like, well, I'm supposed to be working on this serious kind of like Game of Thrones inspired kind of epic about like political struggles, but all I want to write is a book about like, magical girls going to a school and like, trying on different shoes or whatever, and like having like dressing up to go to the ball, and like, what's wrong with me? And it's like, nothing's wrong with you. What you want to write is the magical girls going to the ball. You don't want to write the like Game of Thrones, dark, gritty epic, because that's not where your head is at right now. And honestly, if unless you've signed a contract that says I will deliver this book by this date in this form, and, in which case you might have to do that, or you might have to just write to your editor and be like, hey, you know what? I need an extension.
Right.
Don't force yourself to write something that's not making you happy, or that's not, I feel like forcing yourself to work on things is another way that people kind of suck the joy out of writing.
Totally.
And I think that especially when things are bad, we should just write whatever is giving us joy right now, and whatever is like making us excited to be working on stuff. And that could be something that's like super dark and political and relevant, because you're like, I have to confront this thing that is going on in the world. Or it could be something really just like fluffy, and nothing wrong with saying fluffy. It's like, whatever makes you happy.
Right.
And I think, especially if you're partly writing for your own enjoyment and just as a practice to sort of help you survive, just have fun with it. Write fanfic if that's what you want to write. And I think whatever makes you happy.
Right. But sometimes, so yes to all of the above. I couldn't agree more. But again, the nature of this book being also the fact that there is a lot of darkness going on in the world, and some people might want to sort of take that on. I love another quote of yours along those lines of, anyone who imagines a different reality is helping everyone else to see our power to act and to make changes. Imagination is always a form of resistance to domination and oppression. So some people might be wanting to write about climate change, or might, and I agree that the people who aren't feeling that, who are feeling the other stuff, I think that we should go with our hearts and trust our guts, and maybe we'll come back to the heavier stuff later, whatever. But if we are feeling compelled to tackle climate change or the political situation, whatever, I love that notion. Again, imagination is always a form of resistance to domination and oppression. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need more hope in our storytelling right now. I think that there's been a lot of talk about this the last like several years of like, we've had kind of a lot of dark, dystopian, grim storytelling, and the world is getting dark and dystopian and grim. And what we really seem to be craving right now is stories that give us a reason to hope and to keep going and to actually believe that we can get through really scary stuff if we work together and use our imagination and our and build alliances and community. And I think that that's really important to talk about in fiction. I also just think any kind of storytelling that is like, escapist or fanciful or, invokes like a different world or like a different kind of reality is going to help us to kind of free ourselves from this idea that like things are a certain way because they have to be a certain way. And like, this is the way it's always been, and this is the way it's always going to be. And like, this is the way things are done, and we can't do things any differently. And, all this stuff, which is honestly just usually nonsense. Like a
lack of imagination.
Lack of imagination, but also a lack of historical awareness. Mm-hmm. A lot of the time when people, the harder people try to insist that things have always been done a certain way, the more likely it is going to turn out to be that we started doing them that way like 30 years ago.
Right.
And we're just like the people who, started doing it 30 years ago don't want us to go back because they like it this way.
Right.
Like, and so I think that imagining just like other ways of living and other, even if it's just like, a fairy tale about like, eating cake or whatever, it's helping us to just sort of get out of this mindset of like, this is what's reality. This is, you can't possibly do anything different or change anything. And it's just helping us to kind of free ourselves from this kind of courseness of like, this is the way the world is kind of.
It's sort of, if I may put words into your mouth, or at least try to paraphrase kind of what I'm hearing, it's almost like a reminder that we create our own realities, right?
We really do. And politicians know this, which is why politicians are obsessed with controlling the narrative. And
right.
Politicians will, basically, string together things that may or may not be true to create a picture of the world that is their preferred framing of reality. And it's like, if you're a politician who wants everybody to be afraid, you're going to be like, there's immigrants and they're coming to, take your jobs or kill you. And there's all these other scary things. And, look at this giant smog monster that's stomping across the countryside. And if you're a politician who wants people to be more hopeful, then you're like, here's all the reasons that we can hope and that we can persevere and stuff. But people will create their own narratives that are designed to make you support them and their ideas. And
right.
We're very vulnerable to that. Facts are not a defense against that. Like we found over and over again that facts are no defense against really good storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
mm-hmm.
I used to joke about like, I heard an anecdote about someone who was reading anecdotal evidence and fell off an escalator and died. And therefore I think all anecdotal evidence is bad. Mm-hmm. I kind of screwed that up, but you get the idea.
Right.
Like,
right.
There might be one person one time who, ate Pop Rocks and drank soda and died. And so, but it's burned into our brains that like, if you eat Pop Rocks and drink soda, you're going to die, versus there might be millions of people who died doing some other thing, but we don't have a compelling anecdote about it. So we're not going to pay attention to that.
Right. Totally. Okay. One last thing I want to ask you about this book, because this is another thing that we're really talking about a lot in society and in our culture right now. And that's representation without appropriation, right? How do we navigate this? How do we find the balance between wanting to talk about lots of different kinds of people and lots of different experiences without misappropriating or misrepresenting, while at the same time not being afraid to tell from other people's perspectives, not being so afraid to get it wrong that we don't tell those stories? How do we navigate that? Because it's something we're really examining a lot right now in society.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a tricky situation. And I think that good fiction has to kind of represent the richness and variety and diversity of the world. It has to represent, how, many different types of experiences there are. And it has to include marginalized perspectives that have been excluded from storytelling until pretty recently. And I think that we all have to do that work. I think it's really important work that we have to be doing. I think that for those of us who come from privileged backgrounds, like I'm white and, my parents were both college professors. I come from a lot of privilege in a lot of different ways. For those of us who have a lot of privilege in different ways, being aware that when we're writing about marginalizations that are not our marginalizations, we have a lot of responsibility to not screw it up. But also, we don't want to tell a story that's not ours to tell. And none of this is I think that people often want there to be a formula. It's okay, you do this test, you probably get an X and Y and you get this result, and this tells you if it's okay or not. There's no formula. We're talking about human, cultural stuff that is, by its very nature, hard to kind of be precise about and hard to pin down and hard to kind of have a set, thing. And I think that, we just have to be sensitive and kind of pay attention and understand that circumstances are always changing. And currently we're at the very start of a situation in which people from a lot of marginalized backgrounds are, for the first time in a lot of cases, really getting to tell these stories that have not been told before. Mm-hmm. And it feels like we're just barely starting to make a little dent in that kind of, hegemony or whatever you want to call it. And so we need to really support people from marginalized backgrounds telling their stories about their experiences or about their cultures, and not be well, I can tell that story for you, or, I'll be the one to tell that story because, I'm really smart or whatever. I think that, you have to just be aware of there's this thing I mentioned in the book that's a test that Hiromi Goto came up with, which is basically it does a little bit of a series of questions you should ask yourself, has this story been told before? Am I going to be the first person telling this story, mm-hmm. About someone else's experience or background or culture? Is it possible that maybe someone from that culture or background or experience should be the first one to tell that story in a mainstream, big, high-profile venue, rather than me being I'll tell your story for you? So I think that's part of it. And part of what I talk about with representation without appropriation, and that was the essay I spent the most time on in the book. I spent a lot of time talking to people and kind of listening and going back and forth. But part of what I kind of end up with is that, I think you have to include those other perspectives, but not take it upon yourself to be a tour guide, mm-hmm. or to be I'm going to, as a white person, I'm going to lead other white people through this as tourists, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Instead, you have to present it in a believable, fully grounded, realized way, but not try to tell that story that's not your story. So for the example I give is if it's a story about people fighting off alien invaders, and some of the people fighting off alien invaders are happen to be BIPOC people, they can, they should be believable as members of their own cultures and as of their own, people from their own backgrounds. But I wouldn't want to go and tell the story of what it was to grow up in their communities and right. That experience of being an immigrant or being in that community growing up. I would just try to bring as much of that reality to their story about sneaking onto an alien spaceship and, hacking into the alien computers or whatever as I could, so that they feel like real people doing this thing that's not specific to their culture really, but it's a thing that I want them to feel like they're not just stick figures or whatever. I mean, it right. always comes back to not creating stick figures, I think.
Right.
So it's complicated, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, I love that distinction, that particular distinction of, are you the first person to tell the story? I think that's really important.
Or one of the first.
Or one of the first. And particularly if you're not part of the group that the story is about. And I think what a lot of people are doing now also is getting people from those respective groups to read how they've represented yes. characters from those groups as well, right? Which seems like a
good
practice. And
pay them for their work.
Pay them for their work. Yes to that. Okay, something you talk about, actually, I said that had touched on the last point of never say you can't survive, but actually there's one other thing I want to talk about, and that's world building. And we have danced around this quite a bit, I guess, already, but creating fictional worlds. And you talked about that not only in the book, but also in your TED Talk, which again was called Go Ahead, Dream About the Future. And there's something I loved that you said in that talk, which was, quote, I found that people are really hungry for visions of the future that are both colorful and lived in. I use a mixture of active dreaming and awareness of cutting edge trends in science and technology, and also insight into human history, which we talked about a little bit. I'm curious though, what does active dreaming mean to you?
Wow. I mean, I think literally daydreaming. I think that daydreaming is a huge part of my process. And I kind of talk about this in the book. I think that, we all have things in our heads that we've absorbed from like movies and TV shows and other books that we've read that are kind of like, one example I always think of is like in All the Birds in the Sky, Patricia goes to a school for magic. And it's like, we've all seen magical schools before, in various media. And, so when you're having your character go to a magical school, your first impulse is always going to be to kind of crib from the stuff you've seen before, or to, maybe crib from real life schools that you've gone to or have been familiar with. And like, you want to create something that's a little more distinctive, a little bit more kind of its own, like sui generis or whatever, that's a little bit more kind of unique and weird and kind of colorful and fun. So when I try to come up with something that's unique and different and, feels part of my world, feels like it's something that could only exist in this world I'm creating, I spend a lot of time just kind of like free associating and asking myself questions and trying to kind of build a whole other thing that feels like it logically belongs in the world, but also is kind of just like kind of offbeat and strange. And, I used to get mad at myself when I would be like, okay, I'm going to sit down. I'm going to write 1,000 words right now. Like I got off my day job. Now I'm going to write 1,000 words of my novel. And I would sit there and then half an hour goes by and I've just been staring into space. And I'm like, I'm supposed to be writing 1,000 words. Why have I been staring into space for the last half hour? And it's like, it took me a long time, an embarrassingly long time, to just realize, what, that is me writing.
It's part of the process.
Staring into space, the like zoning out, maybe people watching in this cafe I'm in, or just like listening to music and just kind of like letting my mind wander. That is the huge part of the writing process, because it's engaging this part of my brain that's not, it's like my subconscious or something that is kind of working in its own way on this problem. And I think that that's like a huge thing for me. But I also think that, just trying to kind of put away all the stuff that you've already seen, that you've already noticed before from media that you've consumed, and come up with like something that's like a little bit different. That's a huge part of it for sure.
Yeah. And how does the past, we talked about the past a little bit insofar as how sometimes things from the past we can take for granted because they've been around for so long. When in reality, perhaps we should be questioning them. But you talked about how the past informs your ability to create futures. Can you talk a little bit about how the past informs that process of creating imagined futures?
Yeah, I think that something that I really feel passionate about is that a good fictional world. And by the way, when I talk about a fictional world or world building, it doesn't necessarily mean like another planet or, a magical realm or, Earth 2,000 years from now or whatever. Like what I always say is that every story has world building. And even if you're writing like a realist story that's set in a small town where the post office might have to close or something, and that's what the story is about, you're still creating that small town. You're still like saying, okay, what's the main industry in this small town? What do people do for work here? Did there used to be a factory and it closed down? Like, how close are they to the railroad or to the highway? What stuff do they have in this town? What kind of people live here? Where did they immigrate from? Or, all that kind of stuff.
Yep,
like, what are the politics of the town? That's all world building. And you're doing that even if you write a story set in a real place, you're still doing world building because you're going to create the world as your characters see it. So world building is part of every story, no matter what. But anyway, yeah, I think that one of my pet peeves is when you have world building that doesn't really have a past. And like I just mentioned, your small town, your fictional small town, maybe there was a factory there that shut down 20 years ago and people still haven't really gotten over it. Like a lot of people lost their jobs when that factory shut down and maybe they haven't been able to find another job that was as good. Maybe people are mad about losing the factory. Maybe that's a thing that hangs over them a little bit as like something that they are, that's like an ongoing thing in the town. And so I think that, the more you have like a past, the more there's a backstory to your world, the more it's going to feel lived in and real and just fleshed out.
Yep.
And like a place that you could actually visit. And the other thing I say in the book is that if the world has changed in the past, that means we know it can change in the future. And I think that that's important because a world that has a static past where like people are like, this is the way it's been for 10,000 years. Oh yeah, these kings have been in charge for as long as anybody can remember. And we've always done it this way. That's a world that has a lot of inertia, that has a lot of like, that's actually resistant to change in a really fundamental way. That's going to make the story possibly less interesting, I think, unless it's like this world has never changed before and suddenly it's going through massive changes. But even that, I'm like, really? Like, really? I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. The other thing I wanted to ask you about from the TED Talk was this quote. Speaking of the world ending, we're about to speak of the world ending. Everybody is obsessed by apocalypses, even though the world ends all the time and we keep going. So what did you mean by the world ends all the time, but we keep going?
I mean, I really believe that. I think that, when you talk about like things like a singularity or an apocalypse or whatever, these things happen on a pretty regular basis where, our entire way of life is completely disrupted and, maybe our civilization as we know it is irrevocably altered in some way that is kind of an apocalypse that's kind of to many people is kind of the end of their world. I think that, for a lot of people, a huge political upheaval can feel like the end of the world, or a huge natural disaster that just like, oh my gosh, my entire town just burned down. That's kind of the end of your world in a lot of ways. And I think, huge historical earth-shattering events are kind of like apocalypses in a way. I don't know if we're ever going to, I think if we have a capital A apocalypse where, things really do come to an end in some really dramatic way, we might not realize it for a long time afterwards. We might just be like, oh, looking back, that was the moment at which really everything stopped, or in which all these things became no longer possible. And I think that we need to sort of get used to the idea that rather than building up the apocalypse or the singularity is this huge thing that's coming, it's a thing that happens on a pretty regular basis. And we got to roll with it. And we got to it doesn't mean that we should be happy about it or make it happen on purpose, but we need to understand that, we go through things where the world becomes something that would have been unthinkable to the people from, a year earlier. And maybe the people now can not fully remember or understand what the world was like a year ago,
Pandemic,
it's
anyone?
I mean, that's, I did that TED Talk before the pandemic, but that's a perfect example. I don't think the world is ever going to go back to what it was before the pandemic. I think that, it's going to always be different now.
Absolutely. So speaking of different and speaking of transitions and speaking of different worlds and imagining futures, all of that, let's talk about Victories Greater than Death, because you did imagine a future in a whole other world. You built a whole other world for Victories Greater than Death. There it is. Do you want to say the title?
Victories Greater than Death.
There it is. We just had to get Zoom to go to you. So give us the brief synopsis of what this book is about.
Yeah, so Victories Greater than Death is my first sort of young adult novel. It's a kind of space fantasy epic. It's about this girl named Tina who has found out at some point that she's not a normal human girl on Earth. She's actually an alien clone who was left on Earth as a baby in the care of a human woman until she was old enough to resume her life as like a space hero or whatever. And she's, she doesn't have any memories of being this hero that she was in her previous life. But when she's old enough, the aliens will come and bring back her memories of her previous life. And she will resume her awesome, adventurous, swashbuckling existence. And that's all she wants. She's just waiting for the day when the aliens show up to come and take her away, which is honestly super relatable to me. Like I spent my entire teenage years and a lot of times since just wishing that aliens would come and frickin', take me away from this planet and like get me off this planet and take me somewhere else and just be like, no, actually, you don't belong here. You belong with us. Like what happens with Peter Quill in Guardians of the Galaxy, except a little bit less traumatic, like without the mom dying and everything. And just like, or the TARDIS from Doctor Who would just materialize and I'd be invited to go on an epic adventure through time and space. Like that's
and it will all make so much sense. And it all makes so much sense.
Yeah, exactly. Everything will finally make sense and I won't have to go to school anymore. And I won't have to obey all these silly rules that I don't like. And I won't get bullied anymore. And so basically Tina is just waiting for this to happen. And then the aliens do show up and, spoiler alert, it's not exactly what she was expecting. Things don't go the way she was hoping. And she's kind of plunged into a really kind of complicated, dangerous situation where one of the only things she has going for her is this other group of kids from Earth who she didn't even want to have come along. She just wanted it to be just her, but she ends up having this whole posse from Earth of other kids who are there with her, helping her get through this. And they all form like a tight bond and become like a family. And it's about kind of realizing that, in the end, it's about kind of realizing that this heroic destiny that you thought you wanted isn't really what you want. And what you want is to, have love and friendship and community and, to save the world with a bunch of other people.
Right.
And join together and to do the right thing together.
So what was it like writing young adult versus adult, or what you normally write? How is that different for you? Challenging and fun and both sides of the coin, sort of.
It was a huge adjustment. It was huge like challenge. It was super fun as well, but huge adjustment. Like, with young adult fiction, the pacing is so much faster. You have to have like the emotions have to be like right, super intense and super vivid, and urgent. But the story just has to keep moving forward, and the main, and the main character and all the teenagers have to be at the center of it. They have to be like at the center of the story, driving the action, and which is awesome. And that's part of what I love about young adult fiction. I love that kind of centering of the teen characters and that kind of feeling of just like being on a seat of your pants adventure. That's what I love about a lot of YA books I've read in recent years, is just that they're super fun and fast paced and exciting. But, there were times when my editor kind of had to sit me down. Like I had already struggled to kind of do that to my best ability and like had studied a lot of YA books. And then once I handed it in, my editor was like, yeah, here's all the ways in which this isn't really a YA book yet. And you need to
like what?
Pick up the pace here. Mostly I think that there was my first draft that I handed in of Victories Greater than Death had a couple of major problems. One was that it was too slow to get going. Tina didn't, get off the Earth and go into space and join this alien spaceship quickly enough. Like I when I originally sold the book, I had like a sample that was like the first 42,000 words. And then I ended up rewriting the whole thing and handing it in. And my editor was like, yeah, this has really got to be a lot faster, this opening section. And so those 42,000 words, I looked back later, they ended up being about 25,000 words instead. So I cut about 17,000 words out of the first third of the book.
Yeah.
And there was stuff in the early parts of the book where Tina wasn't driving the action enough. And she wasn't she wasn't providing enough of the urgency. There was other stuff that was going on. And so I had to really I ended up cutting out a major character from the first like half of the book who I just was like, this person is getting in the way. They got to go. And that was heartbreaking because I loved that character.
Kill your darlings.
Once I got rid of that character, the book was just so much more fun and exciting. And Tina was more at the center of things. And Tina, I just had to get a little bit more deep into Tina's perspective and Tina's ideas. And there's a lot of stuff that Tina has to learn over the course of the book that, she has to come to understand. But at the same time, we have to be on Tina's side the whole time, and we have to be in her perspective. And I think there was a part of me that was still kind of writing a little bit from like a little bit showing how Tina was wrong about stuff, even while we were in Tina's perspective.
Oh, interesting.
And that we couldn't have that. So I think stuff like that, it's a different animal. And I feel like the book ended up so much better once I kind of followed my editor's, advice. And once I also just sat with it a little bit more and tried to kind of streamline it and make it more of a proper YA. It definitely, I think it improved the book, even if it had been an adult novel. I think the new version is better. But I think it was a hard adjustment. It was tough, but at the same time, getting to write like all that action and all that fun and all these teenage characters bonding and, forming friendships and having like conflicts, but then working it out and being kind of enemies, but then becoming friends and like all that drama and stuff. It was so fun to write. And I just had I had such a blast with it.
Well, I hadn't read YA for a long time, for like decades. And for me, that was really what's, I got it in the mail and I started reading it and I had trouble putting it down because I was having so much fun. And I mean, honestly, I mean, that's the word, that for me, I was just having so much fun. And also I didn't see the first draft, but on the draft that, the final draft, I mean, for me, again, not being a YA reader or whatever, but the pacing it just moved for me at the right clip. And it just kept my interest and it kept me going. So from my, whatever it's worth perspective, you nailed the pacing in the end from my perspective. So, and it is a lot of fun, no question about it. Yeah. So, but the other thing that I was wondering about insofar as the challenge of doing YA is, and something that again was really convincing to me, and so I'm curious about this, is the voice. I mean, the voice it's written in, it's a YA voice, including a lot of humor, because you have a lot of quips in the book that I love, that they're kind of sprinkled throughout. And there's a lot of, funny moments. Again, like oftentimes it's like a quip versus like an entire scene. It's not like the scene is comic necessarily, but there's just a lot of great one-liners. So tell me a little bit about, writing the YA voice. Was that, I'm assuming that was also part of the challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned already that I studied other YA books. One of the things I did was kind of really look at like, how do they do this? Like, which YA books are first person versus third person, present tense versus past tense? And, I kind of tried it a bunch of different ways. I was like, okay, let's try doing it third person, past tense, present tense, and
really, in the end, went through all those. Interesting.
Oh yeah, there's, I mean, God, there's so many drafts of different versions of this book, including some that are kind of unrecognizable. When I was first figuring out a lot of basic stuff, I was just like, okay, let's try writing. Oh, this didn't work. Okay.
I love that.
I mean, I'm very much a trial and error kind of writer, and everything I publish, there's embarrassingly weird and clunky drafts that hopefully nobody else will ever see until, a long time from now. But, I was really trying on different voices, but I liked the idea. Like, I always like a sarcastic, kind of snarky first person narrator who is kind of making fun of things. And a big benefit for me of like Tina actually having lived on Earth and having had a human childhood, even if she's actually an alien, is that she can make references to like Britney Spears or whatever when she's in the middle of a space battle, and she can be like, yeah, this is just like that time that we all ate like 10 bags of Doritos and chugged a 3-liter bottle of Coke in one chug, and then this is how our stomachs felt like that, and this is how my stomach feels right now as I'm facing this like alien super monster or whatever, right. Stuff like that. I think that's helpful in kind of grounding you in the story. And especially with a space story where, there's this idea, which I don't know where it comes from, that like young adult fiction, like that fantasy is better or is more beloved or more popular or more feasible in young adult fiction than science fiction. And I definitely think that there's a little resistance to outer space stuff in YA, even though I can name off the top of my head like a dozen great space-based YA books that I've read recently. And there's definitely a lot out there, including stuff that's really successful. But there's that idea. And I think for me, as a general rule of thumb as a writer, anytime I'm doing stuff that's like huge and weird and outlandish, the more I can keep it grounded and personal and relatable to someone on Earth, the better. And so, with this book, with Victories Greater than Death, definitely the further we got into larger than life, like epic, painted on the side of your van kind of huge, incredible space stuff, the more I was like, okay, this really needs to be rooted in this like super personal voice that's like kind of making wisecracks and also having like emotional reactions to everything. And B, we need to really feel the emotional stakes for these characters and feel their relationship and feel their kind of like small scale, entirely personal concerns, so that it doesn't get lost in just like a forest of like, it's just so easy to just get distracted by big shiny objects. And so that was the thing that I really sweated over. So thank you for saying that worked for you, because that's really important to me. It really
absolutely worked for me. It absolutely worked for me. And like I said, not having read YA for so long, I was like, why haven't I done this? Why have I not been reading YA? It's fun.
Oh my God, there's so much great stuff out there right now too.
Yeah. Well, you have inspired me to check it out. So thank you for that.
Yay.
And you've already set it up for me to read others, because this is part of a trilogy. So let's talk about the fact that it's a trilogy. And also, so two questions about that. One is, how did you know it's a trilogy? Two, is that because you are, you have Gratna descent, or you're of Gratna descent? Is it related to that somehow?
Oh, nice. I love that. You're the first person to ask that. I love that. That's so awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How did I know it was a trilogy?
Yeah.
I mean, I think mostly because before I sold the first book, I had spent like so much time building all of this stuff that was like all these different aliens, all these different planets, all these different like societies, and like this super complicated backstory. And like when I sold the first book, in addition to that 42,000 word excerpt I mentioned, I also gave them like a thudding great document that was like, here's everything I've come up with about these worlds, just so the publisher and everybody would understand that this isn't a thing that I just kind of threw some stuff on the page and I didn't think it through. There's a lot of complicated stuff in that world. And I was like, I wanted 3 books to be able to explore that whole world. And, at the time, I think when I first sold it, YA books were mostly trilogies. And now there's been a move a little bit more towards duologies, which is, I think makes a lot of sense in some ways, having just written the middle book of a trilogy, which is I'm so happy with how it turned out. But middle books of trilogies, it turns out they're actually kind of challenging.
Why is that? And what
surprisingly? Because you have to kind of deepen the story. You have to explain more stuff. You have to get deeper into the world. You have to heighten the stakes. You have to do all this stuff, but you're not really able to resolve everything.
Right.
It's not the beginning. It's not the end. It's just the middle. And like, I should have known from like writing a single novel, like beginning and end are often like the parts that you're like, okay, this kind of makes sense. Oh, and then there's just like this giant middle where a bunch of stuff has to happen. And we just have to get deeper and more complicated and more kind of in it. But it's just the middle, the middles are hard.
Yeah.
So I felt like it needed to be a trilogy just to be able to get through all the stuff and to be able to fully like explore this world that's so kind of rich and complicated, which I hope, I think the second book adds a lot to your understanding of a lot of stuff from the first book. It really we kind of pull back in a huge way, and all the stuff that I hint at in the first book, you see it like full on in the second book. Like you just, we get to see all this stuff that's only kind of just like, we just kind of glimpse it in the first book.
Okay.
So that was really fun to do, but also a huge challenge. As far as the Gratna goes, man, I love that. So the Gratna are these aliens in the first book who definitely, spoiler alert, play a big role in the rest of the trilogy, who they have 3 of everything instead of humans have 2 of everything. So they have like 3 eyes, 3 limbs, 3 lobes of their brains, just 3 wings. They have 3 of everything, and they think in threes, and they don't think in terms of like this or that. There's always 3 options in any situation.
I loved that whole concept.
I'm having a lot of fun with that, especially in the third book of the trilogy. I'm having a lot of fun with like, really, how does this work? What does this mean for their society? Like, how does their language work if they like, what would their language really be like if they don't have like the binary that we have? So I think that's really interesting. And, I think that the Gratna would definitely think it was cool to have 3 parts of the story, especially if it was 3 like ways of looking at the story, maybe.
Right. Well, and that's
it kind of is in a way.
Yeah. And that's why I love that concept so much. Besides all of the details that you just described, it's just a reminder to us not to think so binary. So, I mean, that's also why I loved it.
Oh my God,
it's,
yeah.
Right. It's just like an excuse to look, what if we didn't think of everything yes and no and black and white and blah, 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 again, binary. So I loved everything about that in them. One thing before we move on, I want to touch on is something you said in your Forgotten Planet interview about this massive world that you said, that massive pile of papers that you dumped at your publishers and said, look, this is legit. There's a lot that went into this. You said that for these characters, it's a trilogy and you wouldn't necessarily want to come back and revisit these characters, but because this world is so vast and developed and you put so much into it, that you might entertain the possibility of writing something else that takes place in this world. So can you tell us just a little bit about what's so compelling about this world, besides the amount of time you put into it, obviously, but what is it about the world that might keep your curiosity and might make you want to revisit it? And again, it doesn't sound like you've decided you're going to, but at least you were open to that possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have some ideas for a fourth book that I think would be really fun to do. And I think it would be very different from the trilogy and go in a very different direction. I think that, what really I find compelling about the world is, partly it's these different alien societies, like I mentioned, and like in the second book, we really spend a little bit more time getting to know some of these societies and their rules and like the different cultures and like the different, politics of different worlds that I feel like I could easily spend like a book or two just like on the, among Yato the Manthas people, the Iraeans. I spent a lot of time building out like, what is their communal culture about? What do they use for money? Like, what do they do? How do they deal with like, reproduction and property and all this other stuff, like just so much stuff that I would love to spend more time with. That these books, because of that fast pacing we mentioned, we often touch on a thing and then just got to keep moving, got to get on to the next thing. And like I would love to circle back around and just be able to spend more time on some of these things. Also just like the galactic politics and like the politics of, there's all this stuff that we kind of start drilling down into in the second and third books of the trilogy that I think is really interesting, that feels very relevant to me, where, you have the organization that Tina joins when she leaves home is called the Royal Fleet. And it's part of this kind of like galactic peacekeeping force that works with this government, which is kind of the figurehead is this queen who is connected cybernetically to these artificial intelligences that can see like much more than any human or any organic creature can. They see what's happening all over the galaxy and they put it together and they help the queen to understand what needs to be done. And I love that. I think it's really fun. But the Royal Fleet, we kind of get these hints that before the Royal Fleet, there was this horrible oppressive order called the Seven-Pointed Empire that basically, you start to realize that the people who founded the Royal Fleet were more or less the same groups of people who had been running the Seven-Pointed Empire in much the same way that, the US kind of Pax Americana is in some ways an extension of the British Empire. Mm-hmm. And, did the British Empire really fall or did it just become the American Empire? Questions like that is, if you make a kinder, gentler version of something, is it really any different? Things like that I would love to just spend like a bunch more books kind of thinking about. Mm-hmm. But I think, I would like to tell, I've never had a world like this that I created where I was like, I want to just tell a bunch of different stories in this world because there's all these corners I want to get to and all these, like, I feel like I could tell, like the trilogy as it is has huge stakes and has kind of like a lot of like, nothing will be the same again by the end of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that it would be really fun to tell some stories that are a little bit more small scale, that are a little bit more like, it's the story of one starship trying to do a thing in this world and the stakes are a lot lower. And we're just going to like see what it's like to get through, to go to these places and deal with this stuff.
Right.
I would love to do that for future books.
Right. All right. Something to look forward to. Something else I wanted to ask you about. We talked about representation, and there's a lot of diversity in the characters throughout the book, both human and non-human and alien. And almost everyone, including the aliens, when they introduce themselves, they use their gender pronoun. And there are a couple of interesting things even beyond that. There's one group of aliens who has its own gender pronoun for its own gender that's just specific to that group of aliens. For another group, using any kind of gender pronoun is, quote, a battle to the death level insult. So we're starting again. This is another thing that we're obviously looking at a lot in society and evolving as a society. But can you just talk a little bit about what's that sort of emphasis and exploration of expressing gender identity, even with the alien worlds, and kind of how that fits in?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, part of what bugs me is when you meet aliens and they have roughly the same approach to gender and sexuality as humans, because that always seems a little unrealistic. And I understand that it's also a problem if you just kind of put all your gender diversity in your story onto your alien characters and say, well, the aliens have gender diversity because they're aliens. And the implication might be that, gender diversity is an other thing. It's like a thing that's not us,
right.
Which is why I was so careful to include gender diversity among the human characters. And there's even more of that in the sequels. The human characters get more gender diverse as the story goes along. And, one character explores being gender fluid, which I'm really excited about. So that was the thing that I had a lot of fun with. I feel like specifically the pronoun thing, it was really important to me that, like, if you have a universal translator type thing, which is what the EverySpeak is, and it's translating from any language into any other language, it should make sure that there are no misunderstandings whatsoever, which would include making sure that nobody gets anybody else's pronoun wrong. And, I'm very careful in the first book to say that not everybody hears other people's pronouns spoken out loud. Some people just kind of mentally get a thing where they're like, oh, I know this person's pronoun now, depending on what language you're speaking, depending on where you're approaching it from. But you will know someone else's pronoun. And I kind of make it clearer in the second book that even if you met someone and you decided on purpose to use the wrong pronoun for them, the translator would make it so that nobody else hears that, because it's like, you clearly made a mistake. This is a misunderstanding, and we're trying to avoid misunderstandings. And therefore, this person uses she, her pronouns, but you used he, him pronouns for them, or this person uses they, them pronouns, and you used he, him pronouns for them.
Right.
I'm just going to fix that before anybody else hears it, because clearly this is a communication failure.
Yeah.
And so it's impossible to misgender anybody, which I think is super. And for me, it's kind of a little bit of wish fulfillment. It's a little bit of like, I would not mind if that was the thing we had in the real world.
Right.
But the thing I try to get a little bit deeper into in the second and third books is, what is a pronoun? Like, what do we like at its most fundamental level? A pronoun is a thing that we use for talking about people in the third person without using their names. And, it gets a little, I actually tried one time to write a story where a major character had no pronoun. And it was in the third person. And it was just like, Fred said that Fred was going to the store, but then Fred realized that it got really clunky. And I had to do a lot of like gymnastics to avoid just having it feel like we're reading the same name like 5 times in a sentence. I either had to construct the sentences really weirdly, or I had to just let go of that. And so pronouns are very useful. They're a useful thing. What information do they need to include? Do they need to include information about gender or sexuality? Do they need to include, information about social class? And I think, so thinking about these alien societies, I was like, well, what are these pronouns for, and how are people using them? And are there characters who we're maybe hearing their pronouns as she or he, but really, if you knew their language, it would be a little bit more complicated than that.
Nuanced.
In later books, we meet a species where they have 3 pronouns in their language: fire, blood, and I think rain. It's fire, blood, and water. And those 3 pronouns refer to different social groups that have different jobs in the society. And, and those pronouns tell you a lot about a person, but they don't tell you anything about, reproduction or gender or sexuality. They just tell you about other stuff. So I had a lot of fun with that. I thought it was a fun thing to explore.
Fascinating. All right. There's so much more I would like to ask you about, but we have come to the end of our hour. So Never Say You Can't Survive and Victories Greater Than Death are both out now. Where can people go to find out more, Charlie Jane?
I have a website at charliejane.com. I'm on Twitter as Charlie Jane, and Instagram is Charlie Jane Anders. Come say hi.
There you are. Go say hi. I have one quick question in parting before I do the actual final parting words. I'm curious about Writers with Drinks. I think you did something was it with Green Apple and Jasmine and a few other writers that was kind of like associated with Writers with Drinks? I'm just curious, because I've been to a few of them and I really love them. You had great writers the times that I went when it was at the Makeout Room. So I'm just curious, is that still kind of in limbo, or are you going to resurrect it when things calm down, or what's the latest on Writers with Drinks?
Yeah, so we were going to bring back Writers with Drinks in September of 2021, and the COVID numbers just weren't quite where I wanted them to be at that point, and so I decided to hold off. But we have a pretty firm plan at this point to bring it back for November.
Excellent.
So November 13th, 2021, the return of Writers with Drinks.
Is it still Makeout Room or?
Still Makeout Room, yeah.
All right, excellent.
Fingers crossed.
Venue.
I mean,
yes.
Situation is obviously still fluid, but I'm really hoping.
Right. All right. Fingers crossed. I hope so. I will try to be there if and when it happens.
Yay.
Thank you again, Charlie Jane. This has been great. I really appreciate it. And we'll do it again with your next book. Maybe we'll do it with the second part of the middle book, and we'll analyze whether, how that challenging effort went, but I'm sure it's great. I'm Matthew Felix. More about me at matthewfelix.com, and more about the San Francisco Writers Conference, including details about this year's writing contest, lots of virtual events going on, and of course the 2022 conference, which you can now register for. So please register for it. And yes, it should be in person. Again, just like Charlie Jane just said, things are changing, but it looks as if that should be in person. And I know they're looking at protocols to make sure, depending on what the situation is, it's safe for everyone, but go register now. 2022. Like I said, Charlie Jane is going to be one of the, keynote speakers. So check it out. And that is at sfwriters.org. And thanks for joining us. And until next time.